But this talk is based on my book, A Pope and a President, on John Paul II and Ronald Reagan. And in that, it's about a 600-page book, and I start with the shooting of John Paul II, May 13th, 1981. And then I drop back to May 13th, 1917, which is the first appearance of Mary in Fatima. We're celebrating this year the 100th anniversary of all those Fatima apparitions. And so to begin the story in a PowerPoint presentation, a 600-page book, they just released the audio version of the book this week, and I pity the poor man who had to read that thing into audio. It must be 20 hours long, I don't know. But to try to pack this into a short presentation, well, where would you start? Maybe with Fatima, maybe with the outbreak of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. 100th anniversary of that was just marked about 6 weeks ago, October 1917. Maybe with the births of Ronald Reagan, or with John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła as a boy growing up in Poland, where he just saw utter devastation, especially with his Jewish friends. He was the only Catholic boy on the Jewish boys' soccer team, played goalie. His first girlfriend was a lovely Jewish girl named Ginka Beer. He was very close to many of the Jews. And there were more Jews living in Poland than any other country in Europe. And so to watch them be attacked, savaged by the Nazis, and then to have the Nazis be driven out only to eventually be replaced by the Soviets, it's hard to even describe where to begin that story of his life. Their fathers died just a few weeks apart in 1941. Both of them, their mothers became very sick at the age of 8, when they were each 8 years old, when Karol Wojtyła was 8, when Ronald Reagan was 8. Karol Wojtyła lost his mother that year. Ronald Reagan almost lost his. And if Ronald Reagan's mother had died from the influenza epidemic in 1919, that winter that almost took her life, I wouldn't be up here giving this talk right now, because there's no way Ronald Reagan would become president. I mean, she was that formative in his life. So how to start this story? Well, given the focus today, we're going to start it with Fulton Sheen. Fulton Sheen, from Peoria to eventually right here to New York City. America's bishop, as his biographer, Thomas Reeves, calls him. I mean, imagine a time in America when a priest would be on the cover of Time magazine. I don't know if that'll happen again. I mean, maybe there might be some candidates for that. If I was running Time, I'd put some on the cover, but I mean, that's how influential he was. I love this quote: "Moral principles do not depend on a majority vote. Wrong is wrong, even if everybody is wrong. Right is right, even if nobody is right." It's very true. Karol Wojtyła and Ronald Reagan would confront the Nazis and the Soviets, but so would Fulton Sheen. And in fact, Fulton Sheen did it really before they did. Sheen used to say that between the Nazis and the Soviets, there's not a vast difference between them. It's really interesting. I had so many different quotes when I first started researching Ronald Reagan, before I even knew who Fulton Sheen was, before I became converted to the Catholic Church in 2005. And so a lot of the quotes from Reagan that I had read and already known and put in books, so I knew them almost from memory, I would read very similar statements by Fulton Sheen in regard to the Nazis, in regard to the Soviets. And this one here is one of those. "There's not a vast difference between them," Sheen said in the summer of 1939. And that was right before the Hitler-Stalin Pact, the Nazi-Soviet Pact, was signed in August 1939 that would launch World War II. And World War II was launched by Hitler and Stalin signing a non-aggression pact on August 23rd, 24th, 1939, agreeing not to attack one another and to mutually invade Poland. And it was 1 week later, September 1st, 1939, that the Germans invaded Poland. And 2.5 weeks after that the Soviets invaded Poland, coming from the east, September 17th, 1939. By the way, Sheen predicted that these two would eventually ally, even though other people said, "Oh, yeah, come on, the communists and the Nazis, totally different ideologies." He said, "What class is to Russia, race is to Germany. What the bourgeois are to the Russians, the Jews are to the Germans. As Americans, we are not concerned with whether a dictator has a long mustache or a short one, right? or whether he invades the soul through the myth of race or the myth of the class. We are concerned only with the fact that there has been an invasion and expropriation of the inalienable rights of man. Hitler and Stalin were two gangsters. They were both assassins of justice, one killed for race and the other for class. I mean, for the Nazis, being a Jew was a death sentence. They killed according to ethnicity. For the Soviets and the communists, they murdered according to class. One of Lenin's original henchmen, M.Y. Latsis, ferocious Latvian, he said, "What are we doing? We are exterminating the bourgeoisie as a class." That's what we're doing. The first question that we ask is, to what class does he belong? That defines the fate of the accused. So they were both killers, just for different reasons. One ethnicity, one class. Sheen, a radio star, TV star, household name before Ronald Reagan and Carol Wojtyła ever got on radio or on TV, or were household names. And he called out, he really focused on, Sherry and I and David were talking backstage about the breadth of all the different topics that he did and all the different things that he covered. But one of his callings clearly was to take on atheistic communism. And among the formative moments in that, he had a meeting with Pope Pius XI in 1935 in Rome. And Pius XI realized Sheen's talents, his intellectual capabilities. Sheen spoke multiple languages, read multiple languages, and he urged him to really dive into a study of Marx. By the way, 1935, for Pius XI, that would have been right between Quadragesimo Anno, 1931, great encyclical on communism and socialism, and Divini Redemptoris in 1937 on atheistic communism. So Sheen, being, as always, a faithful son of the church, dove into that, started reading. Sheen, to this day, I've read quotes from Sheen on Marx that nobody else excavated because no one else that I know has translated those documents. He read different Marx writings in French, including this one, "Communism Begins Where Atheism Begins," which Sheen reported in his 1948-49 book, Communism and the Conscience of the West. Sheen said Marx was not first a communist and then an atheist. He was first an atheist, then a communist. Communism was merely the political expression of his atheism. Vladimir Lenin said, "There is nothing more abominable than religion." They were convinced, as Pius XI said in Quadragesimo Anno, that you could not be a communist and a Christian. The two were mutually exclusive. Soviet communism, said Sheen, had put before the world a dilemma, an apocalyptic one. They have thrown down the gauntlet to the world. The voice is either brotherhood in Christ or comradeship in Antichrist. Communism was inspired not by the spirit of Christ, but by the spirit of the serpent, the mystical body of the Antichrist. I've been asked a number of times if Sheen and Ronald Reagan ever met, and it's a great question because they both came from these two little towns in northwestern Illinois. And Reagan had lived in a half a dozen of these little towns. They were both born, both of them were born in tiny little northwest Illinois towns in apartments above a hardware store. You talk about humble beginnings. Two boys from the Midwest. They had #1 shows on television at almost exactly the same time. Sheen's Life is Worth Living and Ronald Reagan GE Theater. I asked Nancy Reagan a number of times if I know it's a number of times because I went back and in compiling the book, I saw 4 or 5 emails that I had sent over the space of about 10 years, and maybe hoping that something would be kindled. But she told me, she said, I said, I would imagine, it's hard to imagine that they didn't meet. But she said, to my knowledge, I don't know. I don't know if they've actually met. Michael Reagan, who was Ronald Reagan's adopted son with Jane Wyman, the famous actress. And by the way, Jane Wyman died a third-order Dominican nun. She became very, very devout. Michael told me that Jane became so religious by the 1980s that what was the TV show she was on in the 1980s? Anyone know? Falcon Crest, good. Falcon Crest. Michael said that she had drawn into the contract that there be a priest on the set with her every day to administer the Eucharist. She was buried in the habit when she died. She came into the church, feast day of the Immaculate Conception, December 8th, 1954. 100th anniversary of the dogma. Just yesterday, right? The Immaculate Conception. She came in with Michael and Maureen, December 8th, 1954. Michael said that Sheen would have this annual Hollywood breakfast, and he joked that of all the celebrities, Sheen was the biggest celebrity in the building. But Jane Wyman was always there, and I can't imagine that Ronald Reagan wasn't at one of those at some point. And I also pose this possibility. I think it's kind of a tantalizing prospect to just imagine Sheen was ordained in 1919. He would have been about 24 years old at that point. And Ronald Reagan and his dad, Jack was Catholic. Ronald Reagan's only sibling, Neil, was Catholic. Neil was a daily communicant, as was his wife, Bess, who just died a few years ago, 102 years old when she died. But I just can't imagine them driving. Peoria, Illinois is right along the route, which is now called the Ronald Reagan Highway, from Eureka College to Galesburg to Dixon to all these different towns. They would have gone through Peoria a number of times. And I like to imagine someday Jack or Neil stopping off to go there for Mass, maybe going in to just pay a moment in front of the Eucharist, maybe stop in for confession, and just this 25-year-old young priest named Fulton Sheen walking around lighting candles, opening some windows, maybe asking one of them if they wanted to hear their confession. And of course, none of them at that time would have had any idea who they were or where they were going. But as Sheen liked to say, this side of heaven, right, we don't know. We don't know the answer to that. Did Sheen and John Paul II ever meet? They did. They met at St. Patrick's Cathedral, and that was October 2nd, 1979. Thomas Reeves writes very touchingly of this. I get choked up when I think about it. But Sheen walking into the Holy Father, this Polish Pope, first non-Italian Pope in almost 500 years. Sheen was really excited about him and comes in and just fell to his knees. And John Paul II lifting him up, literally, and telling him he had been a faithful son of the church. He had written and spoken well of the Lord Jesus Christ. Sheen, when John Paul II got back to Rome, he sent Sheen a formal letter. And Sheen, in response, wrote this long, very touching, very poignant, very eloquent letter in response, which Thomas Reeves quotes at length in his book, America's Bishop. And he predicted there that, he said, about every 500 years, there comes along a pope that completely changes history. And he named 4 of them. And he told this new Holy Father that he would be the 4th. He was going to be that pivotal. He was going to really change things. And it was shortly after that Fulton Sheen died. Torch was passed December 2nd, 1979. Sheen died in front of his private chapel, in front of the Blessed Sacrament, where he had a daily holy hour that he never missed for years. And I see this as kind of a torch being passed. Sheen's battle was against atheistic communism. And right in between, the bookends around Sheen's death, he died December 2nd, 1979. John Paul II came in October 1978. Replaced the Pope, had only been there for 33 days. And then Ronald Reagan got elected on the other side of that in November 1980. And so I think, in a way, I like to picture the torch in this battle against atheistic communism being passed from Sheen onto these two to complete this fight that he couldn't finish in his lifetime. The Sistine Chapel, August 16th, 1978, that was when Karol Wojtyła became, at that point, the 264th heir to the chair of St. Peter. First Slavic pope ever, first non-Italian pope in 455 years. Moscow's private reaction to this, the Soviets were just apoplectic. They just couldn't believe this, that this happened. And John Paul II, for his part as well, was pretty shocked. he turned to Father Zivich and he said the Italian phrase, li posino, which basically translates into, what the, what have they done? Do they know what they've done? I mean, you don't pick a Polish pope, especially right smack in the middle of the Cold War. The Pope's supposed to be Italian, right? Do they know what they've done? And somebody knew. Something knew. Holy Spirit knew. October 22nd, 1978, he gave his first homily where he exhorted the faithful to be not afraid. Open the doors to Christ, open them wide, open the borders of states, open the borders of economic and political systems, open the vast domains of culture. This is Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet leader. I figured I'd throw this in here. We now have this conversation. He immediately, the new pope said that for the first foreign visit, they asked him, where would you like to go first? If you had to choose your first foreign visit, what's it going to be? He said, Poland. I'm going to go to Poland. Leonid Brezhnev, the leader of the Soviet Union, immediately got on the phone to Edward Gierek, the Polish communist leader, and told him to tell the Pope to cancel. And he said, how can I tell him to cancel? My country's Polish. The Pope is Polish. And he said, make up an excuse. Tell the Pope to say that he's fallen ill and he can't make the trip. As if he knows that in like January. I'll be sick in June, right? And then probably every June for the next 26 years, I won't be able to make it. But Gierek told him, I can't say that, and this isn't the actual phone call. That's not an actual picture of the phone call, but I found a picture of Brezhnev with his shirt off, and if you can't make fun of an overweight communist dictator, who can you make fun of? So he called him and he told him to cancel it, but he didn't. So June 2nd, 1979, he went to Poland. 9 days it would truly change the world. June 2nd through 11th, 1979. And I'd love to know Sheen's thoughts on this, on this particular trip. Lech Walesa said that he came to Poland, Lech Walesa, the Polish Solidarity leader, and the 20 who followed me were suddenly 10 million. It was a greater multiplication than the loaves and the fishes. Massive outdoor rallies. And then he said he held his first homily of all places in Victory Square. You gotta love that. Symbolic importance, right? Victory Square. And he said he made this statement, which is exactly what Moscow didn't want him to say. This is what they feared the most. Christ cannot be kept out of the history of man. The exclusion of Christ from the history of man is an act against man. He said you can't understand the history of Poland without understanding the Polish people's relationship with Jesus. And then this, there can be no just Europe without the independence of Poland marked on its map. And that was a shot heard around the world. The New York Times, in response to this, just kind of shrugged its shoulders, right? It wrote an editorial. As much as the visit of John Paul II might reinvigorate, maybe re-inspire the Roman Catholic Church in Poland, it does not threaten the political order of the nation or of Eastern Europe. Yeah, right. Right? Not at all. Not at all. Tell that to the Soviets, huh? Ronald Reagan at the time, Richard V. Allen, who was Reagan's national security, foreign policy advisor at the time. Reagan had just run for president or made a bid for the Republican nomination in 1976. It failed, was planning to run again in 1980. Allen told me, he said, I was sitting in Reagan's living room with him. We had been talking foreign policy all day, and we decided to turn on the evening news. In those days, there were like 3 channels, right? CBS, ABC, and NBC, that was it. Turned on the evening news, and we watched footage of the Pope's visit to Poland with these massive crowds that turned out. And Allen said, I looked over Reagan's eyes, and there were tears in his eyes. And he said, that's it, that's it, that's it. The Pope is the key, the Pope is the key, the Pope is the key. We've got to get elected, and we've got to reach out to the new Pope and the Vatican and make them an ally. For Reagan, this was a game changer. Reagan went right into his radio studio, like Fulton Sheen, loved the medium of radio. Did radio shows before he did TV shows. And he had nationally a daily syndicated radio broadcast. And he said, Stalin once asked contemptuously, how many divisions does the Pope have? Well, we just saw it. Wherever he went in Poland, huge crowds. 400,000, 500,000, 1 million, 5 million. Will the Kremlin ever be the same again? And then he asked, will any of us, for that matter? Reagan was never the same again. This totally changed Reagan's whole calculus about what could be done to try to win the Cold War. I'll skip ahead here to a couple of, Ronald Reagan won the presidency, November 4th, 1980, 44 out of 50 states, landslide electoral victory against an incumbent president, 41 to 41%, at a time when most registered voters in America were Democrats. 44 out of 50 states, won the Electoral College, 489 to 49. I'll skip ahead a little bit too. Moscow immediately, Reagan was inaugurated January 20th, 1981. Moscow immediately feared an alliance between Reagan and John Paul II. And really chilling to go back and read Pravda and Izvestia and some Soviet media clips and hear them just fomenting propaganda about this alliance between the White House and the Vatican. And get this, on John Paul II, a future saint, the Soviet press denounced him as a malicious, lowly, perfidious, backward toady. Nice, eh? Of American militarists seeking to undermine communism with his overseas accomplices and his new boss in the White House. His new boss. As if John Paul II answered to Reagan. This is the kind of stuff the Soviets did. I quote Stalin, death solves all problems. No man, no problem. If only these two could be gone. They almost got their wish outside the Washington Hilton March 30th, 1981, when John Hinckley was waiting outside with a handgun with 22 Devastator bullets. He wasn't working for the Soviets, just trying to get the attention of an actress, Jodie Foster. Fired shots, several shots, put a couple shots in Reagan, including a shot that almost landed just a few centimeters from the main aortal valve going into Reagan's heart. Reagan could have very easily bled to death. Reagan came out of this and he told a number of different people, the Reverend Billy Graham, Reverend Louis Evans, Cardinal Cook, who flew down from New York on Good Friday in 1981 because Reagan was in need of some special spiritual counseling. Michael Deaver made this call. Reagan's good friend, Cardinal Cook, and he said to him, you have seen the grace of God. You have been saved for a special purpose. And Reagan told him, I know. He said, I feel that God has spared me for a special purpose, which Reagan would see as taking on Soviet communism above all else, trying to defeat what he saw as an evil empire. Only 6 weeks later, everybody remembers, right, that Reagan and John Paul II were both shot. Everybody forgets how close together this was. He was shot May 13th, 1981, outside, right smack in the middle of St. Peter's Square. Makhmet Ali Asha, carrying a 9mm semi-automatic Browning. He fires 4 shots about a quarter past the hour, 5 o'clock p.m. Actually, George Weigel in Witness to Hope says it was 5:13 p.m., which matched the date on the calendar, which was 5/13/81. Which, by the way, was the feast day of Our Lady of Fatima, May 13th, 1981. He fired 4 shots, 2 of them hit the Pope, 1 in the left hand and the other in the abdomen. You see him collapsing into Father Živich's arms, right there. He's rushed to the hospital. He gets there, like Reagan, he was losing a lot of blood. And like Reagan too, there are actually reports in the media that he hadn't even been hit. He was bleeding to death. Barely conscious when he got to the hospital. Last words before he passed out, he said to the nurse, how could they do it? How could they do it? Which is quite a thing to say given that there was only one shooter. He had 5.5 hours of emergency surgery. Blood pressure plummeted to 70. Father Živich gave him the anointing of the sick. They thought he was going to die. Rejected the first blood transfusion. The doctors on site offered their blood for the Holy Father. He eventually required 6 pints of blood. Ronald Reagan needed 8. The bullet just missed the main abdominal artery by centimeters. Over a few centimeters, he bleeds to death in the back of the ambulance on the way to Gemelli Hospital, just like Reagan would have bled to death in the back of the limousine on the way to George Washington Hospital. Asha tried to escape, but he was stopped by a nun by the name of Sister Letizia from the Bergamo region. That's not actually her, but I found this picture of a nun, and I'd like to imagine that's what she looked like. And she held him down, and she said, "You did it." And he said, "I didn't do it." She said, "You did it." And she held him down until a couple other people came along and stopped him. The White House reaction to this, Reagan immediately sent his best wishes and prayers to the Pope, tell him, "I'm praying for you." He had delivered by Congressman Peter Rodino from New Jersey, Democrat from New Jersey, on May 18th. 1981. It's on White House letterhead. I got it declassified at the Reagan Library. And the note said, "Happily, few leaders in the world today have the dubious distinction of knowing with some precision the kind of event that you have experienced. Your heroism is proof that a single irrational act cannot prevail." This created a bond between Reagan and John Paul II that nothing else truly could have. They already had this kinship and this desire to take down atheistic Soviet communism. Now they had the world's most exclusive mutual prayer society and the oddest mutual distinction of both being shot and almost dying. They would meet at the Vatican June 7th, 1982, where Ronald Reagan had wanted to meet with him back since 1979. Their staffs had tried to get them together since Reagan was inaugurated January 1981. They met at the Vatican. They prayed alone in the Vatican Library for 50 minutes. My friend Bill Clark was there outside the room. And they said to one another that they believed that God had spared their lives from the assassination attempts against them the previous year for a special purpose, which they believed was to work together to defeat Soviet communism, with Poland, above all, being the linchpin that could take down the entire communist empire. They committed themselves and their staffs to precisely that goal. This is a great quote from one of the cardinals. "Nobody believed the collapse of communism would happen this faster in this timetable, but in that first meeting, the Holy Father and President committed themselves and the institutions of the Church in America to such a goal, and from that day on, the focus was to bring it about." Carl Bernstein's cover story in Time magazine, 1992, he referred to it as a holy alliance. They would meet a few other times after this: Alaska, 1984, Miami, 1987, Vatican again, 1987, Castel Gandolfo, 1990. David, how am I on time? Probably 5 minutes? Okay. I'll skip ahead to the big issue that I focus on, a thread throughout the book, was whether or not the Soviets did in fact have a hand in the shooting of the Holy Father. And I think it's beyond any question, any doubt. The Italians, I figured this out years ago, and the one thing that I learned was that Ronald Reagan and his team suspected that the Soviets were involved from the very beginning. They couldn't dare say that publicly. But I learned that a very super tight, super secretive study report was done under Bill Casey's leadership of the CIA. Bill Casey from this area, Irish Catholic, head of the CIA. And he put 2 women in charge, and who did an amazing study. I was told one of them, she was in her roughly late 20s, early 30s, other early 40s, who ran circles around the other researchers in Langley. And they produced an internal report where they concluded that the Soviet GRU, military intelligence, with the go-ahead of the KGB and Yuri Andropov, gave the go-ahead and organized the hit on the Pope. The Soviets actually tried to assassinate the head of the Roman Catholic Church. They ordered the hit. John Paul II's reaction to this, I was told that Casey briefed him on it, and John Paul II's response was basically, "Yeah, I know. I'm not surprised." And it was his request that we keep it secret. We not talk about it. We not divulge it. He didn't want World War III starting over this. By 1989, we were making great strides with Gorbachev and the end of the Cold War, and what was done was done. That's how he saw it. 1989 came the eventual collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. Here's a key, everybody. Before the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989, Poland held free and fair elections, June 4th, 1989. They opened 100 seats. The communists lost 100 out of 100. And that was the breach that eventually led to the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Ronald Reagan and John Paul II would meet together for a final time, September 1990. No press, no cameras, nothing. Just the two of them, Nancy Reagan, one-on-one, no ticker tape parade, no victory cigars, no press conference celebrating their role in taking down the Soviets, nothing like that. Two very humble men, wanted no celebration, just wanted to do what they felt were called to do. David quoted this earlier. Special Thanksgiving Mass was held in Krakow in 2011 on the 100th anniversary of Ronald Reagan, the centenary of Reagan's birth, and also for the beatification of John Paul II. And Zivich said that here were two men who stood before this very choice of good versus evil, and their decision and how they responded to that choice changed the course of history and shaped the world in which we live. Being willing to be not afraid, right? Being willing to take on this enemy. They were willing to stand against it, even when people like Reagan were called names, made fun of, savage, for the things that they said. John Paul II believed this was the duty of their talents to do that, and of all of our talents. He gave a great homily December 30th, 1987, 30 years ago now, where he talked about all of us are given individual talents. Look at the parable of the talents as the talents that God has given you. And how you use those talents and what you do with those talents. If you don't use those talents that you've been given, then you are betraying the will of the Creator. And he said, look at the harsh treatment in the Gospels with the man who didn't use his talents, who betrayed his talents. And I'll wind this up just bringing it back to Fulton Sheen. This was a man of immense gifts who used his talents and used his talents very, very well, and who likewise saw all of this, the struggle against atheistic communism, as the battleground, the battlefield of the 20th century. So the battle against Nazism, we won that in 5 or 6 years. But the long battle of the century was this battle against Soviet communism that began in 1917 and wouldn't end until 1989, 1991. And I'll wrap up with this. Another favorite quote from Sheen. The refusal to take sides on great moral issues is itself a decision, right? Choosing not to decide. It is a silent acquiescence to evil. Think about that. The tragedy of our time is that those who still believe in honesty lack fire and conviction, while those who believe in dishonesty are full of passionate conviction. And here were three men, a pope, a president, and a bishop, not lacking in conviction, not lacking in moral courage, and they weren't afraid to use their talents. And they did so, and they changed the world. They changed the 20th century. They rewrote the story of the end of the 20th century, and they changed history. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Paul, what a fascinating discussion. While he was talking, I just had this real sense, Fulton Sheen saying, yes, yes, yes. All right, so you found your hot seat there. Okay, David DeCerto and I are going to flank you and ask some questions. We'll have about 15 minutes that we'll ask questions, and then we'll move to the audience, so get your questions ready. So, David, if you'll join me.
I'm sorry if I went too long and sped through a lot of those, but I knew I was going to go too long and I better skip a few.
No, first of all, just again, I mean, it was a wonderful conversation.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
Appreciate that.
And now he's inspired you to get the book, right? Because he skipped over some of those slides.
Absolutely. I mean, that's another thing. It's the time of year you're looking for presents. It's an amazing book. Again, The Pope and the President. I can't, recommend it more strongly. And it's such. I mean, you cover so much that obviously we can't cover in a brief PowerPoint. We could talk about this for hours, if not days. So thank you for doing such an economical job of
Thank you.
Hitting most of the salient points. That last slide in particular, it sounds like a job description for most of our leaders, regardless of what side of the aisle they're on.
It's really true. It's really true.
I guess reading this book, one of the questions that sort of struck me most was, even really in the 20s, but certainly in the 30s into the Second World War, as Western, culture is collapsing in between both Nazism and communism. What was it about church leaders like a Fulton Sheen or even Pius XI and then his successor Pius XII that were so clear-sighted about communism, and so many statesmen who one would assume had just as much access to the similar type of intelligence? Was it an incompetence to read the tea leaves, or was it more just an unwillingness to call it for what it was?
Yeah, I think, we're Catholics, so we can say this, right? I think there's a spiritual explanation in a sense. And when I wasn't Catholic, I was an evangelical. I was in a Presbyterian church, and I was reading the Catholic Church on communism and some of the encyclicals from the 1930s. I was blown away. I thought, wow, they totally understand this. They understand it up and down. And the encyclicals weren't just diatribes. I mean, they would use phrases like the scourge of communism, the satanic scourge, orchestrated by the sons of darkness, language that was way beyond Reagan using a phrase like the evil empire. But at the same time, they would ground it in Aquinas, Augustine, faith, reason, many, many footnotes to many, many other encyclicals. And I just thought to myself, there's nothing like this in the Protestant world, certainly from that time. And this is quite amazing, but the Communist Manifesto was published in 1848. So that was the programmatic statement, the official programmatic statement on communism by Marx and Engels. In 1846, so 2 years before the manifesto was even published, Pope Pius IX did an encyclical called Quid Pluribus, which right then warned about this danger of communism and how it would completely reorder society, seek to attack the religious, attack the family, attack property, and the immense damage that it was. That was 2 years before the manifesto was even published. And then he did another in 1849. That was the first year of, for him, a 32-year-long pontificate. I think he was our longest-serving pope, other than Peter, I guess, right? And he was, but after that, many, many other encyclicals followed through all the popes. I mean, there aren't any that haven't really made statements about this, all the way up through Benedict the 16th, and Spe Salvi. He talks about the failures of Marx and why Marx failed. And Francis has said statements too about Marxism is wrong, just flat out saying that. So there's been this intellectual consistency in the church on this topic for at least 170 years.
But it's also his prescience. Fulton Sheen, you have a quote in the book, I'm paraphrasing slightly. He said it's almost like he had an advanced copy of Stalin's military plans.
Right.
Because he was predicting them, a year before they actually came to be on the battlefield.
That's right, and that was way beyond. I think a lot of that too was being in New York, where Communist Party USA was headquartered in New York. The Daily Worker was headquartered in New York. And so he was really on the front lines. And he knew a lot of the famous converts, ex-communists who came into the church. In fact, he converted a few of them himself. And so he had a lot of information, a lot of personal insight. But people were saying at the time in the communist movement, oh, well, you've got fascists, Hitler, communists. Hitler and the fascists and the Nazis were killing communists in Germany. Well, they were killing everybody. But as far as Sheen was concerned, the two could find a way to collaborate, to commit evil together, because as he put it, they were both Christ haters, they were both enemies, they were both seeking to do evil. And so they did find a way to collaborate, to the great horror, by the way, of many people in Communist Party USA. A lot of a lot of Jewish American communists left the party because of the Hitler-Stalin pact. And some of them might have even become like small c communists, but they couldn't remain in a party that was dedicated to the Soviet Union after Stalin had cut a deal with Hitler. But Sheen saw it coming.
Yeah, he was absolutely amazing with that. And, his experience being here and having that understanding, even if he didn't have that, I have a feeling he would have known what was coming, because there really is just that tie. If it's communist, it's anti-religion.
Yes.
And he described communism in this way: man was alienated from himself by religion because it made him subservient to God, and man was alienated from himself by private property because it made him subservient to an employer. If, therefore, man was ever to be restored to his true nature, religion and private property must be destroyed.
Right.
That was his quote. So the question is, how did the view of communism that was held by Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul II, how did it agree or differ from that what Fulton Sheen had written about?
Yeah, it was actually very consistent. I mean, they both, and interesting, all three of them would not shy away from using language like evil.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of people, especially politicians, right, they would use more diplomatic language. They would talk about it as a political threat. They would talk about it as an ideological threat, as an international threat in terms of missiles and tanks. But Reagan saw this. Reagan in the Evil Empire speech talked about the phenomenology of evil. What philosophers, as he called it, referred to the phenomenology of evil. Well, John Paul II was a phenomenologist. That's what he did. That's what he taught in philosophy in Krakow when he was still Cardinal Wojtyła. So they understood this at a philosophical. All three of them were very well read, which wasn't appreciated about Ronald Reagan in his time. But Reagan would say till his final days that his favorite book was Whittaker Chambers' Witness. And Whittaker Chambers' Witness, he used the phrase, communism represents the concentrated evil of our time. And that's exactly the phrase that Reagan used in the Evil Empire speech. So that book came out in 1952. Reagan read it from cover to cover. And Whittaker Chambers said some nice things about the Catholic Church on communism as well. He said the one institution, the one organization that is consistently understood the communist threat above all is the Catholic Church. And I wonder if Chambers and Sheen ever met.
Wow. It's in that whole period, end of the war into the 1950s, that was really the high point of Fulton Sheen's popularity as a radio and then later a television personality. And at that same time, the entire entertainment industry, at least out in Hollywood, was really embroiled in almost a civil war because of the House on Un-American Activities Commission and the whole efforts by Senator McCarthy. But surprisingly, Fulton Sheen always tried to position his opposition to communism as a moral endeavor, not necessarily as a political one. And he really didn't make a lot of comments. I think he tried to keep himself intentionally distanced from that fight going on in Hollywood. Can you speak a little bit about why you might understood that Sheen chose to sort of keep that Hollywood battle at arm's length?
That's a good insight. I've never really thought about that. He was not one to call out, Franklin Roosevelt for being soft on communism or something like that, right? I don't know of him ever doing that. I know in the Vietnam War, he was opposed to the Vietnam War, and he had a lot of credibility on that because no one could accuse him of being a communist dupe, right? I mean, he was Mr. Anti-Communism. And with specific people in Hollywood, I mean, he would make comments about communists being involved in the entertainment industry, but it'd be broader. He wouldn't call anybody out. The Hollywood 10, for example, he wouldn't say, well, as the House Committee on Un-American Activities showed in October 1947 when they presented all 10 5-digit CPUSA cards of every member of the Hollywood 10, they're all communists. And he didn't do that. Yeah. So for him, the battle was more, I think he wanted to take it right at the philosophical level. And think about this. I've met priests who've told me that who really dumb down homilies, and I hate that. And one priest a few years ago told me, he said, well, I think it'll be over their head. And I thought to myself, look what Fulton Sheen did. For a decade, he would sit out there with a chalkboard and write the most philosophical ideas. Marx and Freud and Augustine and Aquinas. I mean, he assumed that everybody could learn whatever he was teaching, and he didn't hesitate to teach, and he was extremely effective. So I think there's a lesson here for a lot of priests today. Never talk down to the laity, to your audience. Look what Fulton Sheen did.
Oh, he so knew the techniques of communication too, not just from a performance standpoint, but also the philosophy of it and the sociological aspects as well. So he really had the whole package there.
He did. He understood so many different disciplines, right? I mean, we were talking earlier about one of our favorite books, Peace of Soul. And Peace of Soul talks about everything from the Immaculate Conception and Mary as the new Eve to Freud and psychoanalysis to Marx and communism. I mean, it hits all these different topics. And you were saying that his first book, he was Father Sheen at that point, with an intro by G.K. Chesterton. I did not know this.
Yeah.
In the early 30s.
Forgotten Philosophy. It was his doctoral dissertation that was printed as a book, but it has an introduction by G.K. Chesterton. So that's talking about a coming together of great minds. That's can't beat that combination.
And just to try to get the breadth and depth of all the different topics that he did, I don't think he shied away from anything. Yeah. And his commentaries, radio or TV.
One thing you just mentioned in Peace of Soul, the thread of Marian devotion. In your book, you write a lot about how obviously John Paul II was devoted to the Blessed Mother, and how Reagan, even as a Protestant, was fascinated by the whole Fatima apparition. Fulton Sheen, his favorite poem was Lady Dressed in Blue, so he had a strong Marian devotion there as well.
Well, and with Fatima, there's a Muslim connection here as well that Sheen noticed. I don't know if it was before anybody else, but I haven't seen anybody any earlier than Sheen talking about it. So Mary appears in Fatima, which is the only village in all of Portugal with a Muslim name. Fatima was the favorite daughter of Muhammad. And she converted to the church, to Christianity, to the Catholic Church. But so she appears in the only village in all of Portugal named for the favorite daughter of Muhammad. And as Sheen pointed out and understood, the only woman mentioned in the Quran is Mary. And they have a surah after Mary, named for Mary. She's revered in Islam. Mary is actually mentioned more in the Quran than Jesus is mentioned in the Quran. So Sheen wanted to know, and Father Andrew Apostoli has done great work on this. Sheen was trying to draw out, is there a message here for the Islamic world as well? And I found in talking to Muslim friends, there is absolutely common ground on the issue of Mary. They have great respect for Mary. And I've mentioned Fatima to a few of them. They don't shrink from that whatsoever. They're like, oh yeah, I could see that happening. Yeah. Her appearing in Fatima. I mean, they're more open to it than Protestant friends of mine are.
That's amazing. Seems like a real opportunity for some kind of a conversation.
I think so, and John Paul II understood that. I think Pope Francis as well. And John Paul II, when he visited Mahmoud Ali Asha, his would-be assassin, in prison, and forgave him personally, he said that Asha was obsessed with what he was calling the goddess of Fatima. Fatima, above all, was what interested him more than anything else. And he was afraid that in a kind of like rigid Muslim understanding of justice kind of way that she was going to strike him down for what he did. But for John Paul II, that was a point of conversation and commonality for him. And I think for Pope Francis too, Pope Francis, picking the name Francis, there's never been a pope named Francis. And Francis, the original Francis of Assisi, tried to convert the Muslim world. He had been a crusader initially, and then after leaving crusades and that kind of life, he eventually made an olive branch, tried to meet with the Sultan, and made overtures to the Muslim world. And Pope Francis has been doing that since the very first days of his pontificate. So I wonder, a lot of people think, well, he picked the name Francis because they like the environment or something. I think there's a lot more to it than that. I don't think it's just something about the moon and the sun. It might have to do also with his understanding on Francis and Muslims, possibly.
Sure, on multiple levels.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we're coming up on the 800th anniversary of that meeting between St. Francis and the Sultan.
Interesting.
So, yeah,
Wow.
that happens
Wow.
in 2019.
Okay.
So,
Well, that's
okay,
interesting.
one last question, then I think we'll open it up to the audience. But we were talking about women just a moment ago. We're having a moment in our country. It's a woman's moment, and that's all right. I think it's probably has its due here. But communism boasted that it really leveled the playing field for everybody, regardless of race, creed, sex. They didn't talk about religion because that was all bad. But everybody had the same ability to work and produce.
Right.
Now, we know, looking back, and even looking then when this was coming out, that really just simply takes away the dignity of a woman. But what did John Paul II and Ronald Reagan, how did they view women through that lens of communism? How did they treat that subject?
Yeah, I don't know about necessarily through the lens of communism, but John Paul II wrote just a number of beautiful encyclicals, and just has some great work on this. Ronald Reagan, I guess really nothing in particular that stands out to me on that, but short answer. Maybe trying to stay out of trouble.
It's a good segue, isn't it? Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and take some questions from the audience. Let's see, we've got a microphone that will go around.
Well, first, let me thank you. Your presentation was absolutely excellent. I found it very interesting.
Thank you.
I have a connection to Ronald Reagan. I went to Stonehill College in Massachusetts, and my best friend was his photographer. And at the moment, her brother was. At the moment, the brother is still the photographer for President Trump. So he was Reagan's photographer. Wow. Just to shift away a little bit from Pope John Paul and Ronald Reagan, in terms of where we are today, you're very knowledgeable about those times, what was going on. No greater evil could compare to communism. But for Pope Francis, do you see any kind of great evil that he's battling today in our community?
Yeah, it's interesting. Francis talks about the devil probably more than any pope in memory. And so he's been, he's used some very, very strong language in his defense of the family, and threats out there to the family, and abortion. So in some of those areas, and in fact, a lot of conservatives are often surprised by that. Francis has been caught in these kind of ideological lines, right? People want to say, oh, is he a liberal pope? Is he a conservative pope? I just say he's just pope. I mean, it just doesn't really, but he's been, some of his language on the threats to family, he's referred to, speaking of Hitler, he's referred to gender theory as demonic and, quote, comparable to the educational policies of Hitler, unquote. It's pretty amazing. I mean, he hasn't used language like that about anything else, including the environment or immigration or other, kind of classic social justice issues. So he's been very, very vocal on those things. And what I have kind of a collection of those Francis quotes, and I'll send them to liberal and conservative friends alike, and they'll both be completely shocked and don't even really know how to react to it. But on that issue more than anything else, he's been very vocal. Sure.
Yes, right here. You could just wait for the microphone just to work its way down.
It's coming.
Curious, if you don't mind sharing why you converted to Catholicism.
Oh, that's a long story.
The brief version.
the brief
The
version.
Cliff Notes.
Well, yeah, it's a long story, but I think above all, I just came to came to the conclusion that I think the church has the truth and the fullness of the faith. And on so many different levels, from the intellectual tradition to the theological understanding. I mean, here we are the day after the Immaculate Conception, which is December 8th. I was just thinking about that one yesterday. It's so profound. The connection as Mary, the new Eve, the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of the New Covenant, and there's so much there that you just can't get in any other denomination, certainly. So, and also too, I became convinced of the truth of the Eucharist. I became convinced that the Eucharist really is to be understood as the literal body and blood of Jesus through a process of apostolic succession that line only runs through the Roman Catholic Church, going back 2,000 years. And also too, as a Protestant, just watching the constant splits in denominations and major doctrinal statements changing just by democratic votes based on 400 people that gather every 4 years in an annual assembly somewhere in the Midwest or wherever. That's not certain enough for me. And there I think of my friends in the United Methodist Church. They meet every 4 years, and they vote on these incredible doctrines. And oftentimes the vote depends on whether or not the African delegation was there or not. And so it's like, well, was this truth or not? Based on how people are voting, you can't do that. But the denomination that I was in, Presbyterian Church USA, PCUSA, which used to be the mainline denomination of the Presbyterian Church, the two PCUSA churches in my backyard in Grove City, including the one I attended, they both now are new Presbyterian denominations. They both splintered from PCUSA. So they've already left that. So among Presbyterians alone, you have Reformed Presbyterians, Orthodox Presbyterian Church, Presbyterian Church of America, ECHO, I think, is the new denomination. They call it the split peas because they're constantly splitting so much, the Presbyterians. And so, the one church that has that consistency that hasn't changed is the Roman Catholic Church. And, it doesn't change on these core moral doctrines and issues. So I found that, among other things, very attractive.
Yeah. Just a follow-up comment. I'm also a convert. Much of the same reasons, many of the same reasons that you had. So
Yeah.
here we are.
Yeah.
Yes.
So imagine that, right? You're up here, two out of the three are convert. You're not a convert too, right?
I know, but born and raised, yeah.
All right.
All right.
So,
Well, you
but-
kind
but
of
two-
even us
but
out,
two-
so
two
that's-
out- yeah,
that's
two-
good. That's
two
That's why
out
I'm
of
sitting
three.
over here. So.
And I came into the church in 2005. The vigil that year was when John Paul II died. And he played a key role in my conversion. See, once I start talking about this, I can keep going and going and going. But I'll just say quickly, 3 John Paul II encyclicals that I read as a Protestant that blew me away. Fides et Ratio, Faith and Reason, Veritatis Splendor, the Splendor of Truth, and Evangelium Vitae, the Gospel of Life. I still remember where I was on Route 80 driving over Ohio, over a kind of a low river with my wife on the right, and I'm driving, and she was reading to me the Catholic Church's position on the death penalty from Evangelium Vitae, which is an issue that I always struggled with. And I almost hit the brakes. I said, that's it. That's right. That's got to be it. They nailed it. And I just had this sense when I was reading the documents from the Magisterium in particular that, well, these Catholics claim that the Holy Spirit really does speak through the Magisterium of their church. And when I read the documents, I thought, it seems like that's right. I don't know any other documents in any other denomination by any other person or Christian writer that just seems to nail it, have it exactly right from beginning to end. And not that they agree with me. All right, they're changing my view on a lot of these things when I'm reading it. But sometimes you could just, sometimes you can just tell that even if something sounds good, but it's not true, right? You're like, yeah, I know that kind of sounds right, but nah, it's just not correct. Likewise with truth, sometimes you just think, yeah, that's it. That's just got to be right. So I had that sense with the
Well,
Catholic
G.K.
Church.
Chesterton, I think, said that some truths are very difficult and complicated to unlock, and they need a complicated key.
Right.
And he said he just found out that reading all the church documents, they had that complicated key that fit that complicated
Yeah, that makes sense. No, that's really true. It unlocked so many riddles,
Yep.
so many things that were hard to understand.
Yeah.
And everything plays together. It all works.
It does. It does work together.
If you're reading one thing on the surface, it doesn't always make sense until you really get that key you're
Right.
talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. The fullness of all of it. Father Newhouse, who was probably known to all of you well, just talked about the fullness of the faith that you get through the Catholic Church. It's all integrated, really into a whole where everything. There just doesn't seem to be contradictions. I mean, there are obviously with what some people do and how some people interpret things, but in terms of the magisterium and the actual teaching of the church itself, no.
Yeah. Again, as Chesterton said, there's paradox but not contradiction.
No,
So there's,
it's great. It's right on.
We have probably time for one more question. Lady here right in the front.
Here comes your microphone.
First of all, I wanted to just thank you all. This is a wonderful presentation, and I'm taking a lot away from that. I met Sheen when I was a child. I had a long-lasting impact. You have tremendous influence on my life. But really what I wanted to say is a quote of his that I've only seen once, and it seems to be the precursor of many of the quotes that you cited today, and it's this: to settle for what is rather than for what might be begins the descending spiral into mediocrity inexorably.
Oh, that's good.
So,
Yeah, that's very good.
and if any of you had any update on the status of the sainthood and the body, is it being moved from the cathedral, or I'm not following
I don't
that.
have any updates on that, unfortunately. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's a good question. I was wondering about that myself. I was hoping you guys could fill me in on that. No? All right.
Yet. Thank you very much. Just have, gonna, just, if possible, just ask one more quick question.
Sure, and if I could just say on that, if there's anybody to me who ought to be a saint, I mean,
Yeah.
this guy is a prophet. The things that he said and that still resonate, that are timeless, so poignant. I mean, I'm amazed again and again and again when I just grab a book that he wrote in 1955 and start reading it, and it's just profound.
You can flip through any page and your finger lands
Right.
on a memorable quote. Yeah. I mean, wish we had more time. As an art center, I would have loved to have talked even about the idea how all three, Reagan, John Paul II, Sheen, used really the arts, whether it was public arts or classical arts, more than politics, really, to combat communism. So we won't get to that. But last question that I have, in his famous address to Harvard in 1978, which was months before John Paul II was elected Pope, and just a short time before Fulton Sheen passed away, the former Soviet prisoner Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who you do reference in your book, sort of railed against what he saw as the decline of Western culture in his famous speech at Harvard. And he said that in the final assessment, even in the West that was slowly and increasingly divorcing itself from God and traditional values, there wasn't much difference between what could potentially happen in the West and what was happening under atheistic communism. And he said, the split in the world is less terrible than the similarity of the diseases plaguing both sections. So can you talk a little bit about how Reagan, John Paul II, and even Archbishop Sheen, what they might have thought about winning the war against communism, but ultimately the West succumbing to an equally type of toxic disease?
Yeah, well, I would say that of the three of them, John Paul II especially, I mean, he saw the dangers of materialism. And I mean, really, and Sheen talked about this, so did Pope Benedict XVI as well, that the problem with Marxism was materialism as well. They believed in strictly material man. They didn't see the spiritual. They wanted, for them, the be-all and the end-all was the economic question, the class question. And what Sheen understood, and John Paul II did, in particular, was that man's crisis is a spiritual one, a theological one, a religious one. That's where you really find your answers. as Benedict XVI had said, you don't just solve the economic question and then you have an earthly utopia. But all three of them believed that Marxism, they all said this, pledged a false messiah. They tried to, in eliminating God, the communists tried to set up their Marxism-Leninism as a form of religion. But it was a form of religion that couldn't suffice for the real thing, right? But John Paul II was very worried about the West indeed, after the Cold War was over, descending into a kind of a dangerous materialism, a dangerous secular materialism. And I think that's where we are today. Pope Benedict XVI has this great statement where he said, the West today suffers from a confused ideology of freedom. We have freedom wrong. We misunderstand freedom. Freedom isn't really the right to do whatever you want all the time. Galatians 5:14 says, do not live do not use your freedom as opportunities for the flesh, but use your freedom to serve others, right? To treat others more than yourself, better than yourself. The golden rule, effectively. And Ronald Reagan, John Paul II, Fulton Sheen all understood this interdependence between faith and freedom. Reagan called it the twin beacons of the American sky, faith and freedom that brighten the American sky. And if you take the faith out and you have just the freedom, then the American sky isn't going to be as bright. It's going to be darker, and it's going to be harder to navigate yourself around when you dim the light of faith. And I think that's where we are today. You take away faith and you just have freedom, and a society will be rudderless. So I see a real danger in the declining religiosity in America, this expanding category of nuns, people with not N-U-N nuns, but N-O-N-E.
We want more N-U-N.
Right, people with no religious affiliation. So the danger today, I think, is a secular materialism that certainly John Paul II saw this coming.
Yeah, and it's also really, at least I think of it this way, that socialism is just a few steps away from communism.
Yeah.
And there's a wholesale acceptance of the tenets of socialism as a way to live, especially in our youth today.
That's right,
It's
yeah.
a very dangerous spot.
And Pius XI condemned in Quadragesimo Anno both socialism and communism. And in Marxist theory, socialism is a transitional step on the way to communism.
Right.
And so there's not a huge difference between them. Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin, they were all part of the Social Democratic Party of Russia before, in 1903, it split into the majority of the Bolsheviks and the minority of the Mensheviks. They were social democrats. Herbert Marcuse, the cultural Marxist of the Frankfurt School, the guru of the 1960s, Weather Underground and so forth, he was a democratic socialist. So I know some people that call themselves that mean something different by it.
That's right.
And they do, I understand that. But these things, it's just a matter of a certain degree of separation. And Quadragesimo Anno said you cannot be a good Catholic and a true socialist.
Well, I want to thank both Professor Kengor and Sherry for being here today, and want to give the final word, since this is the day in honor of Fulton Sheen, to Fulton Sheen. So we have a quote from, I couldn't exactly find the date of where this quote is from, one of his early radio broadcasts, but it's him speaking rather impassionedly about where our great patriots are in battling communism. And I think it both speaks to those darkening skies, but it ends on, I think, where all Fulton Sheen's writings and speeches end, on a note of hope. So we leave it, the final word, to Archbishop Sheen.
What has happened to the great patriots, to our great champions of righteousness? The communists have stolen the Pentecostal fires. They have the zeal, but no truth. And we with the truth must also have heat and passion and fire, the kind of fire that the Savior came to cast upon the earth. Communists are right in saying this world needs a revolution, but not their cheap kind, which merely transfers booty and loot out of one man's pocket into another. We need the kind of a revolution in the United States and in the rest of the world that will purge out of a man's heart pride and covetousness and lust and anger and envy and gluttony and sloth. In other words, the true battle against communism begins within the heart of every single American. It means the recovery of our own great tradition, of our belief in God, of an affirmation in politics and in economic life, and among our politicians, of the things that are right and true before God. Then we need not fear communism, for if God is with us, then who can be against us?